There's a particular kind of heartbreak that existed basically only in the 90s, it feels like. It's not the dramatic, movie ending heartbreak. It's quieter than that. It's, the feeling of sitting in your room all alone after everyone else has gone home. It's the sound of a cassette tape spinning late at night and making that weird noise that always bothered you. It's the realization that the person you thought would always be there has moved on. And somehow, the world kept going anyways. And for millions of listeners, no artist captured that strange mixture of sadness and hope better than Matthew Sweet. He wrote songs about longing, insecurity, and losing things, and losing love and such. But somehow those songs never felt defeated. They were filled with ringing guitars and massive melodies and the kind of choruses that make you want to sing along even when the lyrics are breaking your heart. Matthew Sweet was never the loudest voice of alternative. He was not a grunge icon screaming from the edge of the stage. He was definitely his own thing. He was a guy who understood that underneath all the noise of the early 90s, underneath the distortion and the cynicism and the screaming, there were still people who believed in the power of a great song and just that. A great melody, great guitars, perfect harmonies, the most importantly, a song that can make you feel less alone. And he did that often. This is the story of Matthew Sweet. He's an artist who helped define an era without ever truly belonging to one scene. Matthew Sweet was a songwriter who spent decades chasing the perfect 3-minute pop song, and it's also the story of a career built on some beautiful contradictions. It's neat. He had a very cool career. Long before MTV videos, long before Girlfriend became one of the defining alternative rock songs of the 1990s, Matthew Sweet was a kid growing up in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was fascinated by the magic of music, like all of us, or many of us were back then. But his first connection to music was not about fame or success. It was about discovery, like all of us. The feeling of hearing a song and realizing that somehow someone had created something that perfectly expressed what you were feeling. Matthew Sweet grew up during one of the greatest eras in rock history, the late 60s, early 70s. They were still close enough to feel like living history. The Beatles, the Beach Boys, Gig Star, things like that. That influence would stay with him forever, and it shows in almost every one of his albums. By his teenage years, he was already deeply involved in music, playing in local bands and developing the sound that would become his signature. Classic pop songwriting combined with the energy of alternative rock. But the road to success was not immediate. Like many musicians who eventually became associated with a specific era, Matthew Sweet's path was filled with uncertainty. Think Amy Mann later in her career versus what she was until Tuesday. It's a night and day thing. He moved to Athens, Georgia, a city that was becoming one of the most important music communities in America. Athens was not LA. Athens was not New York. It was not built around the music industry, and maybe that's exactly why he went there. The city produced artists who felt different, artists who were not chasing trends, but creating their own trends. It was here that Matt Sweet became connected with the legendary Athens rock scene and crossed paths with musicians who would become important figures to alternative rock. He was talented. He was writing songs. People respected him. But respect and recognition are not always the same thing, and by the mid-'80s, Matthew Sweet found himself trying to break through in an industry that was constantly changing. The underground and college rock worlds were growing, but the mainstream music industry was still dominated by the big bands, the Bon Jovis, the Poisons, and the Madonnas. There was not yet an obvious place for someone like Matthew Sweet. He wasn't really radio friendly. He wasn't college rock either. There was just kind of nowhere for him to go. He was a songwriter who loved classic pop structures, but wanted the emotional honesty of what would become alternative music, and he did eventually. He also became part of the early version of the band the Golden Palominos, working alongside musicians from different corners of the alternative world. I think I had one of their cassettes. It was okay. These experiences exposed him to a larger musical community, but his own identity was still forming. The first chapter of Matthew Sweet's career was not about instant success. It was about learning, a little experimenting, failing a lot, and starting over. And most importantly, he was discovering what kind of artist he kind of wanted to become. So in 1986, Matt released his debut solo album, simply titled Inside. On paper, this should have been the beginning of something. Talented young songwriter, major label release, chance to finally break through. But the reality was a little more complicated. Inside was not a disaster. In fact, there are some signs of the artist that he would eventually become. The melodies were there, the emotions were there, the songwriting ability was getting there, and the timing was wrong. strong, like everything else. The music world was moving in a different direction, and the album did not connect with a larger audience. It's a pretty good record. It's not the kind of failure that ends a career, but it is the kind that forces an artist to kind of find themselves again. And Matthew Sweet stepped away from the spotlight and began rebuilding. And during that period, he started moving closer to the sound that would define him. The guitars on the next album, they were a little bit bigger, songs were more personal, and the influences became more clear. And eventually that identity would collide perfectly with the changing world of rock music, because Matthew Sweet was searching for himself. An entire generation of musicians was changing the landscape. In fact, I remember Rolling Stone when they did a piece on his second album, Earth, they said that Matthew Sweet's music sounds like a warm sweater. And it kind of does, or it did back then. The next album was going to change all that. In 1991, Matthew Sweet released an album that changed everything. We're talking about Girlfriend. This was not just a comeback record, because he wasn't really coming back because he had never been. This is more of a debut. It was a statement. From the opening moments, the album announced that Matthew Sweet had found his voice. I mean, that was instantly recognizable. Big guitars, warm harmony vocals, melodies that felt familiar, almost like songs you remembered from the past. But underneath all that beauty was something darker, something very sour. These were songs about relationships that were complicated, love that hurt, people who wanted connection but didn't always know how to find it. And that's the genius of Girlfriend, because it balanced two opposing emotions perfectly. It sounded uplifting, but it felt wounded. Or you could reverse that. It felt uplifting but sounded wounded. The title track became the song that introduced Matthew Sweet to the world. I mean, the guitars alone were unforgettable. The video, featuring anime footage, it became a defining piece of 1990s MTV culture. It was strange. It was memorable. And it was unlike anything else that was playing on MTV. And suddenly, he was everywhere. The success of Girlfriend was not just about one song, though. The entire album connected because it captured a feeling. A generation of listeners were entering adulthood. I was one of them. They were leaving behind the certainty of childhood, but had not yet found stability. They were dealing with relationships and such without really knowing how, and this was kind of the manual for a lot of that anyways. Matthew Sweet was writing songs that said, I understand. You're not the only one feeling this way. I love it. Songs like I've Been Waiting, Evangeline, they show the softer side of Sweet's songwriting. Tracks like Divine Intervention revealed the power and the intensity he could bring with a full band. And what a band it was. This album featured some incredible musicians, including guitarists from legends Robert Klein and Richard Lloyd. They made such an imprint on that sound that I've had many people say, I can tell it's a Matthew Sweet song before you even start singing. You just know from the guitar work. And later guitarists that he worked with would kind of just replicate that style, and it worked. Their playing gave the record an edge that separated it from simple power pop. It's not just a collection of catchy songs. This was an emotional landscape going on. It's a record where every guitar line, every harmony, every vocal performance served the feeling of the song, and that's why Girlfriend remains so beloved. Not simply because it was a great album from 91, it was a companion. It's a record that people return to during moments of change, during breakups. It is one of the best breakup albums of all time, next to Midnight Organ Fight by Frightened Rabbit. That's probably my two favorites. During those strange moments when you realize life is moving faster than you expected and you really don't know how to handle it, Matthew Sweet had found that audience finally, but his story was really only beginning, because the strange thing about success is that everyone kind of imagines that as the finish line. The artist spends years of struggling, searching, fighting for recognition, and then the breakthrough happens, and then the audience arrives. Dream come true. End of story. But what happens after that? What happens when the thing you spent your entire life chasing finally catches you? For Matthew Sweet, the answer was not a celebration, it was uncertainty, because Girlfriend had done something few artists ever experienced. It had taken a songwriter who had spent years on the outside and suddenly placed them directly in the center of the conversation. But that also brings pressure. The music industry obviously wanted another Girlfriend. Us fans obviously wanted another Girlfriend. Record executives obviously wanted another Girlfriend, but Matthew Sweet was not interested in simply repeating himself. The easiest thing in the world would have been to do that. But instead of just doing a few catchy singles and all that, he went deeper. He went way darker, more complicated. The result was 1983's Altered Beast, and for many listeners, myself included, it was a surprising turn, almost an off-putting turn at first. Gone were some of the effortless optimism of Girlfriend. In its place was something heavier, very much introspective. When you have a song on your album called Someone to Pull the Trigger, you know it's going to be a darker play. The album explored darker emotions, obsession. It's uncomfortable in parts. Even the title suggested transformation. An Altered Beast, which has one of the coolest album covers of all time, available in like 5 or 6 different flavors. It was good. I had the orange one. The record reflected someone who had gone through an emotional whirlwind of sudden success and was trying to understand what came next. Songs like The Ugly Truth and the aforementioned Someone to Pull the Trigger showed Sweet leaning into a more aggressive sound. The guitars were louder and denser, for sure. The melodies were still there, but they were surrounded by a lot of darkness, and this was not Matthew Sweet trying to make another girlfriend. This was Matthew Sweet acknowledging that life after girlfriend was going to be more complicated. Didn't like it at first, like I have with a lot of albums. But once I started to understand it, I love this album. It's got a lot of good stuff. It's not the obvious entry point. I would not recommend this being a first listen, but it reveals something important about his work as an artist. He was never just chasing popularity. He was chasing honesty. And sometimes honesty can be messy, right? Sometimes it doesn't come with a perfect chorus. That's just how it is. So by the mid-1990s, alternative rock had completely changed the musical landscape. Underground had become the mainstream. Bands that once played small clubs were suddenly selling millions of albums. That was just kind of weird. And it felt like overnight. The world was moving away from the polished excess of 1980s rock and towards something rawer, something more authentic maybe. And while grunge dominated the headlines, another movement was quietly happening, a revival of classic songwriting. A return to the idea that a great pop song never really goes out of style, and Matthew Sweet was one of the artists leading that movement. He had always carried the DNA of the great bands of melody, Big Star, Neil Young, Beatles, stuff like that. But he combined those influences with the distortion and the emotional honesty of modern alternative rock. He created a bridge between the two, the classic and the contemporary. And in 1995, that vision reached its peak with one of my favorite Matthew Sweet albums, 100% Fun. If Girlfriend introduced Matthew Sweet to the world, 100% Fun proved he was not just a one-album success story. This was the album where everything came together. The songwriting, the production, the guitar work, the emotion, the confidence, all that. The title itself was almost ironic. It's, from Kurt Cobain's suicide letter. It was just crazy. But because, while the record sounded energetic and immediate, the songs were filled with the complicated emotions that always defined his work. This was like Girlfriend, but happier, which was kind of neat. It was not simple happiness, though. This was joy. It was also frustration, that's just kind of how life is. The album opened with Sick of Myself, one of Sweet's probably most recognizable songs. It was catchy. It sounded like a celebration. Underneath that chorus was something more vulnerable. It was a song about self-doubt. Obviously, it's called Sick of Myself. It's about insecurity. He could write a song that makes thousands of people sing along while quietly admitting something painful. The record continued with songs that became favorites. I'm just trying to think, because I'm Not When I Need It. I love that one. Each track carried that unmistakable combination of melody, energy. The album also featured some of the strongest guitar performances of his career. The guitars were not just decorations, though. They were additional voices, almost. They sang as much as Matt did, just about. 100% Fun became a defining album of the era, and while it never reached the commercial heights of some other blockbuster alternative records, it's one of the best. It really is. You'll find this one quite often in the used bin. I don't know why that is, but I've seen it there. It's a fantastic record, and it still sounds great today. And after the success of 100% Fun, Matt continued exploring different sides of his musical personality. One of the most interesting chapters came through the collaboration with Pete Droge and Sean Mullins in the supergroup known as the Thorns. This project was a major departure from the heavier guitar-driven sounds that everyone had kind of associated with him. Instead, the focus of the Thorns was just harmony, acoustic guitars, songwriting. It sounds like an album from California in the 70s. It's very, very good. For Sweet, this was not a complete change of direction. I mean, he's always been a retro type guy to begin with. His love of harmony is undeniable. And sometimes it's just three voices singing together that just make something really special. The Thorns album reminded listeners that Matt was never only a rock musician. He was a songwriter first. Guitars were important. Volume was cool. But underneath everything was always the song. And that was like the foundation. Now, in 1997, Matthew Sweet released Blue Sky on Mars. This was a different one, and I kind of don't know where I'd put it if I was ranking it. Sometimes I think it's one of his best albums, sometimes I think it's not. Coming off the critical success of 100% Fun, the expectations were yet again high, and this album represented yet another shift. Instead of looking backwards, Sweet was experimenting more with future sounds. I mean, the title itself suggests that, different possibilities. The 1990s were approaching their end, and music was entering another change. Alternative rock was evolving yet again. The internet was beginning to reshape how people discovered music. The traditional album cycle was changing. It was no longer album, tour, album, tour, album, tour. Things were going differently. And Sweet, always curious, he kind of continued searching. So Blue Sky on Mars was not a simple attempt to recreate past success. It was another example of an artist refusing to sit in one place. Some fans embraced the experimental parts of it. Others missed the raw emotional immediacy. But that tension had always been part of his career anyways. He was never interested in becoming a nostalgia act. He wanted to keep moving, keep finding new ways to express, I think, timeless emotions might be the way to put it. Because at the very center of every Matthew Sweet album was kind of the same question, like how do we connect with each other? How do we understand love and disappointment? Sometimes that's the same thing. How do we hold on to moments that matter? Those questions never changed. Only the sound of them did. By the late 1990s, the musical world that created Matthew Sweet's biggest successes was beginning to disappear. The alternative explosion was fading. New genres were emerging, think hip-hop and things like that. Culture was moving towards a different kind of musical experience, but Matthew Sweet's influence was already established. He helped prove that emotional honesty didn't require abandoning great songwriting. He was part of a generation of artists who reminded listeners that vulnerability was not a weakness. Sometimes admitting that you're hurt was the most powerful thing you could do. And as the 90s came to a close, Matt's place in that era, it was secure, but the story was far from over because the next chapter would take him somewhere unexpected, really. This was the story of Matthew Sweet not ending. It was just changing. At the turn of the millennium, he found himself in a strange position. He was respected. He had a devoted audience. He had created some of the most defining songs of the rock era, or the alternative rock era anyways, and the music world around him had changed. The explosion of alternative rock that had carried guys like Matt into the mainstream was now fading, so the industry was moving towards a new generation of sounds, new technologies, new ways of discovering music. For many artists, this would have been the moment to look backward, tour the old hits, to settle comfortably into the role of a 1990s survivor. But Matthew Sweet had never been interested in that. He'd always been fascinated by music history, classic music that he grew up with. And in 1999, he released one of his most ambitious records of the year, In Reverse. It was an album that felt like a conversation between Matthew Sweet's past and his present. The record is probably my favorite of his albums. I put It 1, 100% Fun 2, Girlfriend 3. That's probably how it'd go. This embraced everything that had made him unique. It's got massive guitars, layered harmony, echo out the ass, reverb everywhere. It's an amazing piece of work. It was a celebration of melody, a reminder that before alternative rock became a marketing category, before MTV and radio stations defined scenes, there was simply the power of a great song. There was a sense throughout the record that Sweet was kind of looking back at his own journey, and not with regret or anything, but, just is what it is. He wasn't hiding in the past. He was embracing it and putting it on display. If you ever get a chance to hear the song Thunderstorm, it's an 8-9 minute song. It is wonderful. This sounds like an album that Phil Spector could have produced. I don't think Matthew produced this one on his own. I think he had help. This is a great album, and probably 20 people bought it. Now, the early 2000s were a difficult time for many musicians who had come of age in the alternative era because, everything was changing. The way people consumed music was changing. But Matthew Sweet, he kept on creating. He was releasing albums. He toured like a mofo, and I have seen him 4 times now. Every time I've seen him, the place is packed out. My sister saw him in Jackson, Mississippi, and said there probably weren't 50 people there. That's just weird the way that works. But he toured, he collaborated, he stayed connected with his audience that supported him. And one of the most important things about his career is that he never completely disappeared. Even when he was not dominating radio or appearing on MTV, he remained a beloved figure among musicians and serious music fans. I can't think of anybody who says, I can't stand Matthew Sweet. I don't know. Either you've heard him and you like him, or you've never heard him. I don't know anyone who doesn't like him. But there was a level of respect that went beyond the commercial success because people understood something about Matthew Sweet. He cared about the craft. He cared about writing a good song, it felt like. And in an increasing era that were focused on trends, that kind of dedication mattered. I like that. Now, one of the most rewarding chapters, it came from a simple idea. What if he recorded the songs that actually did shape him? Not as a nostalgia exercise, not as a collection of obvious greatest hits, but as a genuine tribute, one songwriter to the other artists that influenced him. This idea became the Under the Covers series. And beginning in 2006, I think it was, Sweet teamed up with singer-songwriter Susanna Hoffs of the Bangles to revisit the songs from the 60s, 70s, and then later the 80s. The chemistry between them was immediately apparent. Their voices worked beautifully together. His warm, slightly weathered vocal style, combined with her clear, melodic delivery, created something that felt both familiar and fresh. They sounded like they had sang together forever. The first volume explored the songs originally recorded by Beatles, Neil Young, The Who, and other acts. But the magic wasn't simply in the song selection. It was in the interpretation. They weren't trying to replace the original recordings. They were celebrating them. They basically did them note for note. They approached these songs the way a true fan approaches music, with curiosity. The series became a reminder of something important, that influence is not imitation. The artists we love become part of our own creative language. Matthew Sweet had spent his entire career carrying pieces of the past into the future, and the Under the Covers album simply made that influence visible. I liked him a lot. A lot of people thought, money grab. I don't think it sold enough to make a lot of money, but I liked them. I thought they were fun. And for longtime fans, they revealed something beautiful. The same person who wrote Girlfriend and Sick of Myself was still the same kid who fell in love with great songs in the first place. The enthusiasm never disappeared. In 2003, Matthew Sweet released one of his most fascinating records, Kimi Ga Suki. Title, translated roughly from Japanese as I Like You, represented another unique chapter. This was not a major commercial event. It was not done to chase radio success. In fact, it was not supposed to be released in America. It was raw. It was intimate. It's one of his best records. The album was still chasing and crushing melodies. He put himself on a time crunch on this one. I think he had 1 or 2 weeks. They wrote them all in 1 week, recorded them in another week, something like that. All I know is it took less than a month to put this out. And if you've never heard it, you owe it to yourself. It's a great album. So by the 2010s, Matthew Sweet, he occupied a unique place in music. He was no longer a mainstream alternative rock star. He'd become something arguably more valuable, like a musician's musician, an artist respected by fellow creators. That's kind of, to me, the pinnacle. His career had survived multiple changes to the music industry, vinyl to CD, digital download. Entire business models had come and gone, but the core remained unchanged. As always, a great song. His music continued finding new listeners because it was never really tied to one moment. Yes, Girlfriend, forever connected to the 90s. 100% Fun represents a specific era, and I remember exactly where I was or what I was doing when that came out. So that happens. But the emotions inside the songs are timeless. Everyone knows what it feels to miss someone or to lose someone. That's why these songs survive. They're not museum pieces. They're experiences. Now, behind the scenes, his journey had also included some serious personal challenge. In the later years of his career, he faced some health issues that affected both his life and his ability to perform. He suffered a serious stroke in Canada, I believe it was, that dramatically changed his circumstances. For an artist whose entire life had been built around music, the idea of losing the ability to create or perform had to be devastating. The recovery process was going to be difficult, and I think still ongoing. But he's always been defined by persistence. The same determination that carried him through the years of struggle before Girlfriend is going to carry him through this challenge as well, I hope. His story was never about effortless success, because it wasn't. It was always about continuing, moving on, continuing to write and create. And perhaps that's why his music connected with so many people for so long, because Matthew Sweet understood something fundamental about being a human being. It's like life is not perfect. People get hurt. Damage occurs. You lose people, you gain new people. He understood that, and I love him for it. Every great artist has had a handful of records that define their journey, not always the albums that sold the most, not always the ones with the biggest singles. Matthew Sweet's catalog is interesting because it tells a story of constant searching. He never made the same record twice, and in going back and researching that, I realized that. It just hit me. It's like, none of his albums sound the same. Maybe the first two, but that's it. He never simply recreated the formula that worked. Instead, every album represented another chapter in the same conversation. The conversation between his past and the present, between happiness and unhappiness. Of course, the center of the story's Girlfriend is always going to be. It was released in 91. It remains the record most associated with Matthew Sweet, and for good reason. It sounded like the past, sounded like the future. But the reason Girlfriend is lasted is not because of nostalgia, it's because the album understands something universal. So in the history of alternative rock, there are certain artists who represent a movement. Matthew Sweet certainly belongs in the alternative era of the 1990s, but at his core, he was never really an alternative artist. He was a songwriter. A great song doesn't care what year it was released. It doesn't. And that's why we love Matthew Sweet so much. And to me, that's the real legacy of Mr. Matthew Sweet. Not just a collection of albums, not just a handful of rock classics, but a lifetime of songs that remind us that heartbreak and happiness have always been connected, that sometimes the sweetest moments, pardon the pun, come from the hardest experiences, and that sometimes the songs that break our hearts are the very songs that help put us back together. So that's all I got on Matthew Sweet on this one anyways. I might do an album ranking or something later. Make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, all the things that people need to do to make channels like ours successful. I love every one of you guys. I appreciate all the comments. I love to get down there and chat it up with you. Let me know where you're listening from or watching from. I'm always interested in that. But until next time, you guys, take care.